A very warm welcome. I'm Gerard Vinwan, the Asia Pacific Regional Representative of the World Justice Project, and I'm based in Singapore. The title of this session is Corruption and the Rule of Law in the Time of COVID-19, Spotlight on Asia Pacific. The World Justice Project is honored to partner with the Open Government Partnership and the Chandler Foundation today. On behalf of all three organizations, allow me to record our sincere appreciation to Mr. Tim Hansted, CEO, Chandler Foundation, who will be moderating today's conversation. Tim brings his wealth of knowledge and experience to today's discussion. Prior to joining the Chandler Foundation, Tim co-founded Landesa, the world's leading land rights organization, and launched Landesa's programs in China, the former Soviet Union, and India. He has authored numerous books and articles on economic and social development. He also holds 2 law degrees from the University of Washington and a bachelor's degree from Seattle Pacific University. Without any further ado, over to you, Tim, please.
Thank you, Gerard. It's a delight and honor to be with all of you today. I want to thank the World Justice Project and Open Government Partnerships for organizing this session on such an important topic. For those of you who aren't familiar with the World Justice Project or Open Government Partnerships, I encourage you to get familiar with them. They're two fabulous and impactful organizations. And the topic we have today is important, and the panel we have is fabulous. And we're going to get to them in a second. This issue of rule of law and corruption that we're talking about is so important, and I think doesn't receive enough attention. As we think about the challenges that the world faces and the SDG commitments that countries have made, I look at the rule of law and the absence of corruption as goals that will impact all of the other SDGs. And the pandemic, of course, has created a new situation. It continues to have dramatic effects for the rule of law in many parts of the world, including the Asia-Pacific region. As countries rush to dispense economic stimulus packages to confront the unemployment and economic insecurity, the health issues caused by the pandemic. These are also expediting massive procurement contracts for medical equipment and for other responses, which has led to more corruption and more gaps in rule of law, which in turn are exacerbating the public health crisis. So how should governments, anti-corruption advocates, and rule of law stakeholders in the Asia-Pacific region respond to this situation? What are the actionable recommendations for good practices and policies on open government and anti-corruption? What steps should be taken to encourage national leaders to make tangible progress towards their SDG commitments and national action plans in the midst of this pandemic? And in this webinar, we're going to look at all these issues, and we're fortunate to have an accomplished panel of experts here today, and I'm delighted to have the privilege to introduce them. In order to save time, and because we have some slides highlighting each of the panelists' impressive credentials and accomplishments, my verbal introductions will be brief and won't do justice to the experience that they bring. But first we have Cynthia Gabriel, who is a co-founder and executive director of the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism in Malaysia, otherwise known as a C4 Center. Cynthia is a leading advocate of human rights and good governance in Malaysia. She has spent most of her professional life advancing democratic freedoms, reforms, and policy change, and was recently conferred the prestigious Democracy Award by the National Endowment for Democracy for her brave activism and untiring contributions to the field. Among many other important accomplishments and roles, Cynthia has been appointed to a national council developing an anti-corruption plan that will report directly to the Prime Minister. Next, we have Hector Soliman from the Philippines. Hector is a public interest lawyer and a convener of the Technical Working Group of the Rule of Law for the International Center for Innovation, Transformation and Excellence in Governance. That's a Manila-based policy research and advocacy organization. I think we need to get Hector's slide up there maybe. Do we already have it? There we go, there he is. Hector has 40 years of leadership experience in government, NGO legal service organizations, has worked in international development organizations and in the private sector. And he's brings just a wealth of experience and insights into this topic. Next, from Indonesia, we have Dr. Laode Syarif. Laode is Executive Director of KEMITRAAN. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is the Partnership for Governance Reform. He is a former commissioner for the Indonesia Anti-Corruption Commission. He has substantial experience as a professor, as an advocate, as a trainer, including serving as one of the principal trainers of the Supreme Court of Indonesia in the area of environmental law and judicial code of conduct. And last, but by no means least, we have Ivy Ong. Ivy is Senior Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific at Open Government Partnerships. I think we're looking for Ivy's slide here. Ivy's main role, there's Ivy. Ivy's main role at OGP is to provide guidance and assistance to governments, to civil society organizations, and other key actors across Asia Pacific. And that is primarily in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And she's providing guidance and assistance to those stakeholders supporting the development and implementation of open government reforms. Ivy has considerable experience in open government and open data fields. She also has served in government as a Chief Information Officer within the Department of Budget and Management in the Philippines. So, as you can see, we have a terrific panel with an incredibly rich experience relevant to our topic. But before we get to the panel, and as a background for that discussion, I'm going to do two things. First, I want to provide a summary overview of country-level data on rule of law and corruption for East Asia and the Pacific. This from World Justice Project's 2020 Rule of Law Index. And second, we're going to take two polls of you, the audience, to gain your views of the topic at hand. So to set the scene for our discussion today, let's take a look at the World Justice Project's 2020 Rule of Law Index, or at least portions of it that are relevant to our topic. Was launched just a few months ago. The index, if you're not familiar with it, again, please do get familiar with it. If nothing else from this session, I hope that you will take a close look at the index, because it's an innovative and has been an influential exercise and tool that measures the rule of law on a country basis. The index itself is worldwide, and it's based on surveys capturing the experiences and the perceptions of the general public, but also of in-country legal practitioners and experts. So looking at this first slide, there's a lot of rich information on this slide and probably too much to digest in our limited time, but let me highlight a few key points. First, looking at the far right column of where the countries of the region rank globally, we can see very large disparities. So from New Zealand, which is ranked among the world's top 10 performers on rule of law, it's ranked number 7, to Cambodia, just 2 rows above it, which is close to the bottom. Second point, in terms of regional rankings, and looking at the 3 focus countries for today's discussion, we can see that Malaysia ranks in the middle of the regional pack, while Indonesia and the Philippines both fall in the bottom half of the region for their overall score on rule of law. And then third, in terms of changes from 2019, if you look at the second column there, Of the 15 countries in the region, 11 of them stayed roughly the same, with differences of less than 1% up or down. 2 countries saw improvements of more than 1%, Malaysia and Indonesia, 2 of our focus countries for today. And 2 saw declines of more than 1%. Those were China and Mongolia. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide highlights changes in one of the 8 factors measured in the index, and this factor is the absence of corruption. So again, a few highlights from this slide. In terms of absence of corruption, Malaysia ranks again in the middle of the pack, 7 out of 15 in the region. Indonesia experienced the largest percentage improvement over 2019 in its absence of corruption score, but it's still, overall, it still falls well below the regional average. The Philippines scored well below the regional average for this factor, the absence of corruption factor, and saw about a 2% decline over the last year. We go to the next slide. We're going to look at here are the 5-year trends in the absence of corruption in our 3 focus countries. And of the 3 countries, Malaysia has seen the biggest change, as you can see from the slide, in its absence of corruption score over the last 5 years. After a large decline between 2015 and 2017, it has recovered some ground, but still falls below its score 5 years ago. The Philippines has had a gradual but consistent decline in the absence of corruption over the last 5 years. And Indonesia, well, it scored well below the other 2 countries in the absence of corruption for each of the past 5 years. However, its 2020 score marked its highest score in this category since 2015. And keep in mind that 2020, if I'm correct, and if not, someone from the World Justice Project will correct me, the surveys were done pre-COVID, or maybe right at the beginning of COVID. I should have been familiar with this, but maybe we'll get to that later. Let's look to the next slide. This shows the 1-year and the 5-year trends in the absence of corruption factor for our 3 focus countries. And again, there's a lot to digest on this slide, but the important thing to pull from this is that on the corruption factor, it looks at corruption or perceptions of corruption in 4 branches of government, in the executive branch, the judiciary, the police and the military, and in the legislature. So looking at this slide, we can see that for Indonesia's scores in these 4 categories tend to lag behind Malaysia and the Philippines. However, Indonesia had made significant improvements in the police and military and the judicial branch in the recent years. And by the way, I just had confirmed this, that the surveys were conducted before pre-COVID, or at least before shutdown. So that's something to keep in mind looking at the 2020 scores. We'll hear from the panelists in a minute whether they think things have changed maybe since then. Back to this slide on Malaysia, all 4 categories, that is all 4 branches, we saw modest gains in 2020 over 2019, with the legislative branch most improved in terms of percentage. Malaysia scores highest, as you can see here, in the judicial branch category, with steady gains over the years and well exceeding those of Indonesia and the Philippines this year, last year, and in 2015. Malaysia generally outperforms the other 2 countries in all of the sub-factors, but it does have a steep negative trend since 2015 in the perceptions of corruption in the legislative branch, as you can see down there, almost 25% negative trend, and also in the police and military, which has gone down almost 13%. Then in the Philippines, Again, the Philippines has seen a steady decline in absence of corruption over the last 5 years. Declines in all 4 categories over the last 5 years. And of the 4 categories, the judicial and legislative branch earned the lowest scores. So overall, not a good picture for the Philippines. Next slide, please. So this slide contains some of the headlines from our focus countries relating to the corruption risks during the pandemic. And we're going to hear more about those in a minute from our panel. But before we do, we'd like to hear from you, our audience, via a poll. So we have 2 questions for you, which will appear on your screen one at a time. And we ask you to submit your answers, and we're going to report back to you later. The polling is multiple choice, and I emphasize it is anonymous. We'll share the overall results from you, but the individual results are anonymous. And I'm going to pause for a few seconds here to give you a chance, including our panelists, to answer the questions and submit your answers. Oh, I guess it says host and panelists cannot vote, but we're going to pause for a bit to give you an opportunity to answer this first question, and then a second question is going to appear. Okay, hopefully you all got your answers in for the first question. Now we'll get the second question up there. First question was about challenges, the second question about solutions, and we're going to follow that kind of pattern as we get to the panel. Give you a few more seconds to answer the question. Submit your answers, and we will report back a bit later in the program. Okay, if you haven't answered, by now it's too late, but hopefully most, if not all of you, got a chance to submit answers. Let's turn our attention to the important discussion at hand. Just a preview of how we're going to do this. We are going to do it in 3 components. First, we're going to have a wave of questions for our panelists about the challenges related to corruption and rule of law in their countries around the pandemic and the pandemic response. Then we're going to have a second round of questions for the panelists and give them a chance to provide their insights about recommendations to remedy those challenges. And then third, we're going to go to question and answers from the audience. So you in the audience, please be thinking of questions you have for the panelists. Use the chat function or the Q&A function, sorry, in Zoom to submit your questions. We'll get to those after the 2 rounds of questions. And then we'll close with the kind of brief comments from each of the panelists. So let's start with Cynthia. Cynthia, you are familiar, of course, very familiar with the situation in Malaysia, familiar with Malaysia's scores on the Rule of Law Index, which we just kind of took a quick look at, both overall and on the issue of corruption. And you've seen and experienced the changes in recent years and in recent months with the pandemic. What are the new challenges, or maybe the old challenges that have just been exacerbated by the pandemic related to corruption and the rule of law in Malaysia? You're on mute, Cynthia.
Okay. Thank you very much, the World Justice Project and Chandler Foundation and Tim for moderating us. I was very fascinated when I saw the slides that were presented just now. And I was thinking to myself how fast things actually change in politics and in everything else in our lives. In 2019, it was a different government that was administering the country. It was the government that won a monumental elections in 2018 on a reform agenda. And a big part of that reform was to actually improve governance and anti-corruption. But as quickly as things change, there's been a change of regime in March 2020. And it was done in a way which was very disturbing because it was an internal coup and a kind of power grab that caused a realignment of a political coalition, which was more of a Malay nationalist government, which included also the Islamic Party that's now in power. And that happened on the 1st of March. And the lockdown in Malaysia, which is called the Movement Control Order. I have a next slide. I'm not sure who's actually moving that. Yes, okay. So this slide on the top, it says, 1st of March, there was a new government. On the 18th of March, a lockdown was ordered throughout the entire country. And in our terms, it was called the Movement Control Order. So it was really a very stringent form of a lockdown in which there was no way people could go to work except those who were working in very essential industries. You couldn't even walk your dog out of the house. So basically you were confined in, and only one person per family could go to the supermarket, etc. But because of a shortage of time, I just want to highlight a couple of things. There was a package, a stimulus package that was released in stages amounting to about $60 billion on utilities, infrastructure, food securities, and also to help small, medium scale enterprise. Go back to the first slide, please. Yeah, so healthcare and pandemic control, as well as cash handouts, became a very big part of trying to assist many people who had lost their jobs and so on and so forth. So it was a very critical time. We had a sudden political change, which we were grappling. Many people were dissenting the way in which this new government came about, which I think was very legitimate to ask questions, to demand accountability and so on. And within 2 weeks, there was a lockdown. And all of this $60 billion or 250 billion ringgit in local currency actually were released without parliamentary approval. I just want to stress that. There was no legislative oversight over a huge amount of money that was released from our government coffers to help the people. So it's not a question about whether it helped the people. I'm sure it did. But there was certainly no oversight, no sense of accountability over how the money was being dispersed and how we could keep track. So we were basically in the dark. So I just wanted to also highlight one more thing, which will help us move into the third slide. The next one. Yes, okay. There were a couple of problems which my center, the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, and a couple of other good governance anti-corruption groups, including the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, had been tracking in the most difficult of times. One of it was a procurement scandal that's being investigated by the MACC, as well as some work that we were doing on our own on looking at connections between the businesses and the politics. Who was actually getting the contracts and whether the procurement process was actually going through the proper processes. And so there is one investigation for 30 million ringgit, or that's about 5.5 million that's now under investigation for COVID-19 testing kits. Now, there was a story here because we released some shareholding information that could implicate the current Minister of Health. We asked him to explain if this was something that Malaysians needed to know about a former director of a chain of clinics that he was involved in and so on. And he had actually then responded with a letter of demand to the organization and a threat to sue us, instead of explaining to the public how the procurement was actually carried out and whether there's something for Malaysians to be concerned about and why is MECC investigating it. So we're actually looking at now a shrinking space for Malaysians to express their concerns, Malaysians to express dissatisfaction over the movement control order and whether there was a misuse of power in actually carrying out all of this. Now, to the benefit of the Ministry of Health and a very good Director General of the Ministry of Health, we've managed to bring down the numbers of COVID-19 cases. So there's an argument here about how much control and power is actually needed to make sure the pandemic is within control. So we are now into single-digit numbers, which is quite admirable as compared to how other countries are struggling with it. But the virus is still around and it could come back and there could be a second wave and so on. So the argument and the messages that keep coming from the government is that there is a need to be strict and stringent. There is a need to gazette more laws and so on in order to actually control our movements and control expression to keep the virus down. So it's a very complicated situation also because it's not a government that people have been trusting to improve accountability, to be more transparent and so on. In the midst of all this, I think one of the biggest victims have also been the migrant population. Xenophobia has increased, arrests and the undocumented numbers of migrant workers have now also tripled. Many of them have run away because of a very serious crackdown and a heightened police investigations on NGOs, including my organization, that have been hauled up for making statements and demands for public accountability. So this is very pressing. And I think it has become dramatic even in a context like ours, where we're not just dealing with the pandemic and a very serious economic downslide, where about the poverty rate has now, and unemployment rate has now increased. Unemployment rate has now gone up to about 6%, which has never been the case for Malaysia in a very long time. I believe that we need new strategies. We need to find ways in which to work more effectively, how to build community responses in a way that is more and more impactful, that governments would listen to us, and how do we actually overcome it. I'll share a little bit more on the recommendation slide because I see that my time is almost up. I hope I've given you a bit of a snapshot on how challenging it is in the Malaysian context, politically first, economically, and then with the pandemic, which has changed everyone's lives very, very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that overview of the challenges, and it gives us a real sense. And of course, you're right in the mix. So that's look forward to hearing about your recommendations, and particularly how to balance the progress that is needed to address the pandemic in a way that hopefully doesn't undermine rule of law or absence of corruption. Hector, I want to move to you next about the Philippines. What challenges are you seeing in the Philippines? The Philippines, again, just to remind us, on the Rule of Law Index, World Justice Project scores show the Philippines was already on a downward trend even before we got to the pandemic. What has changed, if anything, since the pandemic and the government's response? You're on mute, Hector.
Thank you very much, Tim, and my note of appreciation for the World Justice Project, and the other sponsors for hosting this very timely forum. The Philippines has had one of the strictest quarantine policies globally, with curfew from 8 p.m. till 5 p.m. Next slide, please. Quarantine passes that allow only, back one slide, please, Kilian. household to buy food and medicine, and a total shutdown on public transportation. The impact of the pandemic has been severe on the poor, especially on daily wage earners and the economy. In response, the government has quickly enacted what we call now the Bayanihan Law, which means communal solidarity and support in my language. This law allocates resources for supplies and equipment for medical frontliners, capacity building for COVID laboratories and social amelioration programs, like cash transfers to the poor and unemployed. Using another methodology, and I found this very, very interesting. This was a very recent publication in a local newspaper based on figures from the Asian Development Bank. The ADB has tallied various COVID response budgets of the ASEAN countries. And you can look at the numbers, huge amounts of money, whether in form of incentives or direct cash, for COVID response, and has put the Philippines in around 6th place with a total budget of about 20 billion US dollars. No matter how you look at it, the sums are huge and provides opportunities for either wise spending or for corruption. Proposed legislation for an economic stimulus package is in the works, called the Accelerated Recovery and Investment Stimulus for the Economy, or ARISE. The bill could potentially cost the taxpayer 26 billion US dollars. The package is designed to help small and medium enterprises, provide soft loans for businesses, and wage subsidies for the labor force. With big monies come big opportunities for corruption. The purchase of health supplies and laboratory equipment has been exempted from the rigors of the procurement law. Media reports have been rife with overpriced test kits coming from abroad and the cornering of the importation of expensive laboratory equipment by unscrupulous individuals and health officials. News broke out that frontliners who died from COVID have not been given financial assistance, which amounts to 20,000 US dollars as mandated by the law. This really got the government angry, and the Ombudsman, which is the constitutional body mandated to combat corruption, initiated an inquiry on its own against the Department of Health for corruption, negligence of health workers, and poor reporting standards to the public. Meanwhile, in the final deliberations of the ARISE bill, certain provisions have been inserted that seem to remove big business from the scrutiny of the Competition Commission. Under the principle of capacity building, allegedly they need capacity building during COVID times, mergers and acquisitions done during the quarantine and within a year after the quarantine is lifted is exempt from scrutiny of the Competition Commission. So this provision has been criticized as using the pandemic as an excuse to go around the rules of antitrust legislation. So Tim, the challenge in my country, and I think the same for Malaysia, is to ensure that public funds are not privately appropriated or policies do not erode fair competition, all in the name of the need to make a quick response to the impact of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. And it'd be interesting to learn how the government kind of justifies those changes in terms of its pandemic response. Well, we'll get, of course, to your recommendations a bit later. Let's move to Indonesia. Laode, Syarif, what are the challenges that you're seeing in Indonesia around corruption and rule of law in this pandemic era?
Thank you very much, Tim, and World Justice Project for inviting me to talk. I knew that I only have like 10 minutes altogether, so I just want to share my slide. Yeah, I hope it is actually clear now. Yes, I give the title of my presentation, Indonesian Legal Response to COVID-19. I just want to give you a little bit of the update on the 21st of July. The number of confirmed positive, it is actually almost 90 now. If we already surpassed China. Daily increase on the 21st of July, it is 1,655 people. So it is actually very grim kind of situation. We are now, we call it a red zone, especially Jakarta, South Sulawesi, and several other big provinces. So the government emergency legal response are as follows. The President Office issue government regulation in lieu of law, then it's approved by the Parliament, it become law number 2 in 2020. My previous office, Corruption Eradication Commission, issued circular letter allowing government officials to receive donations. National Procurement Agency issued circular letter also allowing direct appointment for government project. If you look at the anatomy of the COVID-19 law, it is kind of like unusual because it's got the several characteristics. A budget authority from the government, for example, in Article 2 stated that the government has the authority to make an adjustment on the amount of mandatory spending. Also, the government has the authority to make budget shift. And also, further provision regarding state financial policy as stated in point 1 will be regulated under the Ministry of Finance regulation without the Parliament approval. So the executive can do a lot of things without the approval of the consent of the Parliament. But this is make me very, very actually afraid and worried, because in Article 27 stated that the cost incurred by the governments to support COVID-19 program cannot be considered as a state loss. And the official who issued government policy cannot be sued in civil, criminal proceeding, and cannot be challenged to the administrative court. So this is real, give the impunity, and I think this will create a moral hazard to the executive. As a comparison, if you look at the total COVID budget, it is about $6 billion and divided into 6 categories. It is for health, social safety net, business incentive, small and medium enterprises incentive, subsidy for corporate finance. And this subsidy for corporate finance, I don't really think it is actually have a strong connection with COVID. And also a subsidy for the ministries and subnational governments. Another big problem is that we have big money for COVID-19, but it is not supported with a complete data. For example, for social safety net, we do not have a single verified data. If you look at in the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Welfare and the Ministry of Health, all the data is actually different. So this is actually make it even prone to corruption. And if you look at the realization of that until 17th of July in 2020, for health sectors, they only spend 7.2%. For social safety net, it is already 37.9%. And for subsidy for ministries and subnational government, 6.3%. And for small and medium enterprises, it's 24.4%. And incentive for businesses, it is 11.22%. While corporate finance, it is still zero because people actually asking a question, what is the importance of providing corporate finance with a COVID money, for example? Early sign of corruptions. Yeah, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 7th millennial advisors of the president, I call it. And the 3, it is actually already in newspapers and in TV because they have a conflict of interest with the use of COVID money. For example, the KPK, my previous office, point out irregularities in pre-employment card program. KPK highlight inefficiency and mismanagement in pre-employment card because this pre-employment card, it has go to training, and one of the provider of this training, it is actually one of these advisor of the president. And another one, it is the procurement of one of the state-owned company in Indonesia procure rapid test equipment called Biozek. When actually investigated, it was stated that Biozek is actually made in Netherlands, imported from Netherlands. In fact, it is actually made in China. And how you deal with such case if the law itself, it's already said that they are actually protected from criminal and civil proceeding. And the government reaction to corruption, for example, yes, the 2 millennial advisor of the president actually resigned because of public pressure, because people actually asking, what the hell is this? They are the advisor of the president and the COVID money goes through their companies. And this is a good thing. So the government actually amending the problematic presidential regulations, but issue a new regulation for its flagship incentive training program to close the loopholes. For example, the newly issued presidential regulation number 76/2020, the pre-employment card allowed the program management to demand that ineligible participants return financial assistance in full within 60 days. If they they are still working, but they take the opportunity to use this government. As I said, because we do not have a complete data, so everybody can actually just apply to get a COVID money. Another recommendations and another effort by the governments and civil society is that the strengthening coordination and oversight. Corruption Eradication Commissions, Supreme Audit Board, Financial and Development Supervisory Board, BPKP, and National Disasters Mitigation Agency and COVID-19 Task Force actually working together to make a better coordinations on the implementation and also in the oversight. So we hope this actually can give a good result. And I thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to you on the recommendations. You can finish up your recommendations, but let's move to Ivy. Ivy, you've got, you're from the Philippines, but in your current role, you have a regional perspective. With that regional perspective from the open government partnerships, what do you see as challenges, and either in specific countries or maybe kind of common themes in the region as a whole?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. So first off, I just want to say that for the open government partnership, our fundamental values are all about accountability, transparency, inclusivity, and responsiveness. We know that this is vital as we move through the pandemic. And we've seen that emergency measures in response to the pandemic have affected various areas of open government. In Asia Pacific, there are two particular challenges that stand out. The first one is the lack of open data. 60% of OGP countries in Asia Pacific are not regularly publishing COVID testing data. This is the lowest rate of any region. Among countries who are disclosing data, it's the quality of the data that remains an issue. Just drilling down a bit here, governments are responding to this virus and its economic fallout through fiscal policies and decisions. Budget transparency, obviously, is critical, and it's actually one of the eligibility criteria for membership in OGP. However, according to the latest Open Budget Survey, South Asia remains characterized by minimal or limited budget transparency. History tells us that when money moves as fast as in the COVID response, there is a risk of corruption, inefficiency, and the failure to reach those who need help the most. The second challenge that stands out is something that was cited by my fellow panelists. It's the narrowing of civic space, and it's significantly escalated during the pandemic. Compared to other regions, we're seeing more restrictions in media freedom and criminalization of certain forms of speech, including online restrictions. Digital threats to civic space, such as citizen surveillance and privacy infringement, have also cropped up. A few countries in the region actually have been using security forces using disproportionate violence to enforce emergency measures. Without civic space and the ability for all groups of people to meaningfully participate in public life, most other open government reforms cannot succeed in the long run. Recent research confirms that open government data's impact depends on political agency and press freedoms. Civil society knows, and we've seen it, that we're facing numerous challenges around space, voice, and funding. These challenges affect the capacity for oversight and accountability of stimulus funds that reaches the most vulnerable, or ensuring gender-responsive and inclusive expenditures. Long-term recovery can only be achieved if leaders can persuade citizens that they've used resources wisely and placed citizens first. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Ivy. Yeah, very troubling. Just that lack of open data, the fact that you have the worst performance of any region is actually surprising to me and troubling. And of course, the narrowing of civic space, also troubling. We're running a little bit behind, so what I'd like to do, if it's possible, and Killian will let me know, I'd like to go to the results of the poll so that we can engage with the audience for a second. Earlier, we sought your views on what was the most pressing challenge issue and what was the best course of action should be taken to remedy it. Can we show the results of those quickly before we go to a second wave of questions to quickly get recommendations? So here we go. Thank you. Here we see the answers. We're looking at them in real time. What is the most important corruption-related rule of challenge exacerbated by the pandemic in your community? So you can see the answers there. Weak oversight and accountability institutions look like it got the most responses, followed by lack of transparency and distribution of relief funds, and followed very closely by undermining of fundamental rights, including freedoms of expression, association. Very interesting. Can we go now to the second question and the poll results from those? Best course of action to remedy. Looks like we have all of them got some significant responses, but the number one was a closer monitoring by civil society, community, and independent media. Again, following on but from Ivy's comments, it doesn't look as if that situation is improving for them to be able to do it. Very, very interesting. Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move quickly, and we're just going to have to give each panelist maybe 2 minutes to summarize what you see as what are the remedies. What can various stakeholders in your country or maybe in the region as a whole do to help remedy the challenges that you also articulately laid out in the first round? Cynthia, let's go to you first. You're on mute, Cynthia. Cynthia, you're on mute. We need you to.
Okay, apologies. I just wanted to say two things. One is what is on the recommendation slide, which I believe is a real need to look at monitoring the private sector or corporate actions in this time, because a lot of the procurement is now focused also on governments. And I think we really need to look at corporate liability. One of the things that have come into effect in Malaysia is a corporate liability provision from the 1st of June. And I think that's a very important check and balance, where whistleblower protection, due diligence, and all that need to be enhanced in the period of the pandemic. Second is for the media to be left to do its job. In Malaysia, we've got Al Jazeera being questioned, Malaysia Kini, a leading web portal, also being dragged to court for contempt proceedings and all that. And I think the media is a very, very important channel to actually transmit information, data, and so on. The second part about whether the data is complete and accurate will need to be checked by external forces like Parliament, civil society, and so on. And finally, I think without political will, there cannot be any of these recommendations taking place. So how do we actually ensure that? The only way for me is to ensure that the public and the people are actually aware of what really needs to be done. That they are also asking the right question. It isn't just left to a small group of academics or civil society to talk about these things, but the public also want to know, is there enough testing being done? How are the testing kits coming? Is it reliable? What kind of data can we have real time as a general public? So how do we do that? I always look to Indonesia as an inspiration for public empowerment. And I think this is what really we need to focus on now. Monitoring corporate sector, and most of all, well, political will. And how do we get the people to be on board with this whole exercise? Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Very, and thank you for being so brief and so articulate in those recommendations. Hector, moving to you, the Philippines. What do you see as needed steps to remedy the situation?
Well, Tim, the country is fortunate to have a dedicated government office. It's called the Ombudsman, to attend to corruption matters. However, I personally believe that this is not enough, and there has to be active citizen engagement in the fight against corruption. Just as a note on the weak institutions poll that came out, what has come to mind for me is that even as the Ombudsman, as I have reported earlier and as you have shown in your slide, has launched a investigation into the alleged corruption within the health department, our very own president has come up with a statement that, you know, I stand by my health minister. So these kinds of statements do not provide, you know, any confidence, and sort of weakens, in a sense, the independence of a constitutionally mandated government agency to do its job in order to do its proper job in finding out whether there are corrupt activities. In terms of civil society responses, two initiatives are worth mentioning, and these are flashed on the screen right now, and I hope we would be able to provide the slides to the participants later on. The first is the Coalition for Freedom of Information, the Right to Know Right Now, which publishes reports on the state of government disclosure of data. Although the country does not have a Freedom of Information Act, the executive branch does have requirements on the kinds of information they are required to disclose to the public. The other is the Citizen Budget Tracker, a civil society initiative to provide information on how the COVID budget is being spent and relies on the weekly reports, both mandated by law as provided by the government agencies. To echo the sentiment or the statement of Ivy a while ago, both initiatives have reported spotty and slow reporting of information. And I would like to add to that also the poor quality of the information, especially from the health department, which prompted our vice president to suggest that an online portal of government spending for COVID be set up for full transparency. This is already the vice president talking. The sufficiency and timeliness of information coming from government leaves much to be desired, which poses a serious concern for advocates of good governance, corruption, and the rule of law. My last point is the nexus between corruption and an independent media, which is very much on point on the second response or polling question. Investigative journalism is a very strong antidote to corruption. However, we have had recently two very heart-wrenching experiences. The recent closure of ABS-CBN, one of the largest multimedia networks of the country with the most extensive reach nationwide, and the conviction of the head of one of our online newspapers of cyber libel has sent a chilling effect on press freedom. I believe that press freedom has to be defended and protected in order to check abuse of governmental power, including corruption. Thank you.
Thanks, Hector. Very troubling developments about the freedom of the press in the Philippines. Laode, let's move to Indonesia. The trends on corruption and rule of law there were, as we saw from the rule of law index, not as bad as the Philippines, but earlier you highlighted important new challenges. What can be done to remedy them in Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm going to divide my recommendation into 4 parts. One is for the government. I think the government need more coordination with inline ministries and with provincial and local government. Because at the moment, there are a lot of quarrels among provincial with central governments, among district government with provincial governments, and among ministries. So it seems there is no like a strong leadership from the president in saying something about how to respond to this crisis. I think that's most important one. And the second one on the law enforcement agencies. Once, including KPK, the police, and Attorney General Office, once they receive a red flag from the people, they should go for investigation. Just try to prevent it from occurring again. For example, as I just mentioned to you, when these millennial advisors of the president actually trying to benefit it from the project of COVID-19, using their own online platform, etc. So people, and I think it is not enough for them just to resign. The law enforcement agency actually should go and check I think that's the third one, the second one. The third one into media. Media, it is very, very important, including social media, of course, even though most of them are actually hoax. But it is very important just to give some kind of like a pressure and asking the accountability of the government. And lastly, it's the people, the civil society movement, because they are the one who are actually suffer. So that's why I think we need more transparency and of course more accountability from the government. As I just mentioned, the law itself, it is very, very bad. It gives the impunity almost to everybody to do wrong things. So that's why I think the one and only hope is the people in the media to keep on close scrutiny to the what the government actually doing. I think that's all from me.
Thank you so much. And we're seeing some themes, common themes come out here in these recommendations. Ivy, turning to you, and thank you, by the way, for sharing some of the recommendations and the tools that Open Government Partnership has in the chat function. So all of you and the participants can see some of those there and get direct access to the links. But Ivy, what regionally, what do you see as steps needed?
Thanks, Tim. Just rounding up, threading what Cynthia, Laode, and Hector have shared. For us, open response is an approach that means it focuses on governments making efforts at clear, accurate, and transparent public communications to inform, educate, and partner with the public. That's anchored in robust scientific evidence and expertise. I know the picture that was painted earlier means that it's going to be an uphill battle for the three countries. And we recognize also, particularly for Indonesia and the Philippines, the OGP platform is a vehicle that can do this for longer term response. And you leverage that permanent multi-stakeholder forum and dialogue mechanisms and the 2-year action plans to respond. But going into it, just 3 points to make on this one. The first one is integrate transparency, citizen engagement, and oversight in economic stimulus packages and expenditure priorities. A quick example on this one. In Latvia, emergency contracts for medical equipment were being made without going through the standard public procurement procedures. Contracts were initially not published. This situation resulted in a public criticism. Government responded by creating a single web page for COVID-related procurement where all contracts are listed with relevant information for the whole procurement cycle. But again, the three goals of integrating transparency, engagement, and oversight. Second, integrate systems of public feedback and oversight. Civic monitoring organization Dozoro and Transparency International Ukraine are tracking price gouging for face masks using the government's open contracting data provided through the government portal called Prozoro. This has empowered civil society to develop a business intelligence tool to monitor medical procurement and emergency spending and then provide feedback. They were able to generate analysis and they identified the top 5 companies dominating mass procurement contracts. So this research found that companies sold masks at significantly inflated prices, and the Anti-Monopoly Committee has since opened investigations. Third, build an enabling environment for oversight for independent media and protected civic space. Open government reforms can push back against media capture by governments or economic interests that distort public debate and create barriers to reform. Mongolia committed to adopting a new media freedom law based on international standards to protect journalistic confidentiality, as well as amending the national broadcasting law to protect the media from political influence and promote its independence. So just 3 stories and 3 points, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you for being brief and saving us some time. I think we have maybe about 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to start addressing these the questions that have come from the audience. And there have been quite a few questions and some very good ones. So I apologize in advance for not probably not having time to get to all of them. But I wanted to, there was a question about policies that have been implemented or that have been taken in your countries that have been successful in curbing or at least mitigating corruption in COVID-19 related measures. So we've heard about the challenges, we've heard a lot about what your recommendations are, but are there any like good examples that from any of the countries that other countries might draw upon? I'm just, any of the panelists. I don't know if I should take silence as the fact that maybe there have been no positive examples, which would be discouraging. There must be something. Ivy, can you point to anything?
I was waiting for my co-panelists to share. But one example actually that I want to cite for the Philippines, yes, there are pockets of citizen-led initiatives, but also government-created spaces. So in the current Open Government Partnership Action Plan of the Philippines, there's one commitment around the Department of Labor and Employment basically expanding their dialogue mechanisms where they bring together employers and workers and laborers and making sure that these social dialogue mechanisms surface challenges and concerns that the labor sector has. So you bring together your trade unions, your labor sector unions, public sector unions as well, and basically create that space that regularly meets. And I think if we're gonna think about this COVID era that we're in and post-COVID, the importance of livelihoods and making sure that the rights of laborers are still intact while we're trying to figure out a way out of this. I think that's going to be critical, and it's a laudable response by government, complemented by strong civil society coalitions.
Thank you, Ivy. There's another question here from Hannah Lim. What is the role of the judiciary, and how effective would they be in addressing some of the concerns or allegations of corruption by the executive branch during the pandemic? So the role of the judiciary. Hector, do you have thoughts about that one? Or
yes, Tim. As in any governmental setup, I would think that the judiciary plays, in a sense, what they call the court of last resort, and the potential for oversight through the judiciary is very, very much a process at the end of the administrative line. I think the judiciary is there, but the more important aspect of transparency and accountability really lies in preventing the judiciary to even step in at all. Because if for example, like the examples that Ivy has been saying, that if government only has the has the commitment to publish not only general information, because there is a weekly, under the Bayanihan law, under our emergency response, so there is a weekly report that comes out, but the quality of the report, and it does not go into like the level of detail that Ivy has mentioned. Like, for example, publishing actual procurement contracts and identifying who are the vendors, for how much, for what kind of goods. You know, this kind of detail is not there at all. So I think even if the judiciary is potentially able to track this, I think they are more down the road. And in this very fast changing situation that we are in, I think very important that we have timely information coming from government about how procurement is going on, who are the people benefiting from this, to what extent. And these are not judicial actions, but they are more administrative ones. And they are the ones that I think should be put into place fairly quickly so that the people can understand what's going on. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Hector. And it sounds like your dog was trying to help you answer the question as well. We have a question from Veronica about how can the countries institute check and balance on government emergency procurements during COVID-19? And if parliaments or Congress also want to have oversight or control over procurements, there can also be corruption for their approval. So perhaps we'll go to the former anti-corruption commissioner, Dr. Syarif in Indonesia. What do you think about Veronica's question?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I'll just do the first part of it. How can countries institute check and balance on government emergency procurements during COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you very much. It is quite difficult not to check it, because the government, based on the current law, it is allowed for direct appointment. In the past, you have to go through transparent tender processing. However, of course, the people can actually check it. For example, the Ministry of Education of Indonesia, in order to assist the training for school that has no, for example, internet connections in villages, they give a lot of money to several big companies. And the people actually start crying. No. And these companies actually put it as a part of their corporate social responsibility. I'm talking of Tanoto Foundation, Sampurna Foundation. Those two are among the richest Indonesian, 1% Indonesian. How can you go take the government budget, put it in a big companies, and those big companies actually use it as a part of their corporate social responsibility? So based on that, people actually start voicing their concern, and I don't really think that will actually now. I just hope that actually those kind of information can actually share so that the people can actually voice their concern. The second thing, even it is actually direct appointments, of course, the people still actually can see it. Of course, we cannot actually check the documents, the tender documents. I use in comparison with, for example, using normal tendering processes, but people can actually still see that. So that's why I think my focus, it has to be on two. First, it is actually on the people, and the second on news, on the media. Once, and I hope the KPK still have the same determinations, because now there are a lot of protests of the KPK, very sorry, but once they receive the complaint from the people, I just hope the police and the Indonesian, the Corruption Eradication Commission can go start investigating it, not to wait until the money it is already gone. So I think that's the three advice that I can give.
Thank you. And I think we may only have time for one more of the question, and I want to direct this one to Cynthia. It's a question from Blair Clencourse at Accountability Lab. Blair asks, what creative examples are you seeing of the private sector actively supporting better transparency in the COVID response? I mean, based on your response earlier, maybe we should first ask, are you seeing creative examples? And then what are they and how might they be replicated? You're on mute, Cynthia.
The situation is rather challenging, even for the private sector. One, for example, is the glove manufacturing sector is reaping profits at the moment because of the demand of gloves, not just in Malaysia, but everywhere. So there is, well, a greater recruitment of workers, and at the same time, there is also an abuse of foreign workers in the whole context of allegations of forced labor and so on. And so they're trying at the same time to show that they are compliance friendly, anti-corruption friendly, but not quite meeting human rights regulatory mechanisms to ensure that labor is actually protected and so on. So that is one level of challenge, and I think that's where corporate liability provisions would become very interesting. Second is, I think there have been contributions and donations from the private sector to the government for masks, for example, for giving out money and funds to certain communities so that they'll be better protected, donating PPEs, the protective gears for public health officials and all that. So there have been corporate social responsibility initiatives as such, nothing really creative that I can see, except to show that they're doing their part. Now, I think what I'm trying to say about corporate sector is that we have to move beyond corporate social responsibility, because we have to look at whether they are actually complying to anti-corruption measures during this time of crisis, or are they also provoking a situation which is very vulnerable to make profits and to actually gain profits at the expense of the current situation. So this is what really needs to be looked at. And I believe that effective whistleblower protection mechanisms are essential so that even colleagues and staff of the companies would be able to report wrongdoing, which is currently not something that is in place in Malaysia or enjoyed. So if there is no guarantee that your complaint is confidential and can be dealt with by the authorities, then most people just talk about it over dinner at coffee shops and then it ends there. So there's no issue of actually managing the demand and supply issue of procurement in the whole pandemic exercise. So that's why I think while we monitor governments, it's really important to actually look at private sector. So creative examples, I don't seem to be able to think of any for the moment, unless they are in different countries, but it's basically them trying to show that they are very much trying to help the industry. And many have actually asked the government, like the airline industries and all that, have asked the government to inject money so that they don't go bankrupt. So it's quite a serious situation that we're facing, both in terms of them needing money and them as well taking shortcuts to meet their goals of profit.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. So that's a call to action for our friends in the business sector to you can be the first to be out there and be the creative example for supporting better transparency during this time. We've come near to the end and we're going to have to close, but I want to give each panelist, I'm just going to give you 60 seconds. First I have questions for the same question actually, we'll go Hector and then Laode and then to Cynthia. The question being in 60 seconds. So if you could offer one piece of advice to your fellow citizens or to your government on how they could play a role in dealing with these rule of challenges discussed today, what would it be? Give us one nugget to close. Start with you, Hector.
Well, I think if I think of something that is really doable and something that is helpful and relevant, I would say that government can actually be more transparent about its spending patterns, procurement activities related to the COVID response. We are not there yet. And I reiterate the call of our Vice President to improve the online reporting of the procurement and the activities that are going on for COVID. And I think this is something that, it's not, you just have to focus and do it and dedicate people. It's not something that is very hard to do. I would say you just have to do it and do it well. So that is my piece of advice, and I hope it can also be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. Moving from the Philippines to Indonesia, Laode.
Thank you very much. I don't have a nugget, but I have 2 points. One, for the governments, similar to Hector's, I hope they are more transparent and coherent in implementing the COVID-19 policy, because I've seen a lot of quarrel among them. So the people actually, they don't have some kind of compass where to go. So I really want they stop quarrel each other. So I hope the government, the president say A, up to the local level, they say the similar thing. So the people will have the same information, reliable, and of course, true and correct information. The second, to the people, again. COVID, it is actually hurt the people first, not the government. So that's why if they see irregularities, they have to shout out, they have to yell, so that the people actually can listen. I mean, the government can listen to the demands of the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And from Indonesia to Malaysia, Cynthia. Again, you're on mute, Cynthia.
In our context, I think one of the most critical things to really free is the need for institutions to be independent. And when I say institutions, I'm talking about Anti-Corruption Commission, for example, that it is got to be 150% or 200% impartial in carrying out investigations. Because I imagine at this time, the influence from the powers that be could be even stronger than it is in regular times because of the pandemic, because of the change of government. The institutions I'm also referring to are the judiciary and the media. So if these things are constricted in the name of fighting the pandemic, we're not going to actually win the war. And we know that the virus is out there. It's not something that we can curb. So it's really important to ensure these institutions actually work. But how do they work? I just want to go back to the fact that it has to be the people demanding it and calling for it. Without that, I don't think there's going to be voluntary political will to actually make it work. How are we going to get open data, reliable data? It's not going to come on a silver platter. It's got to come by some kind of organized demand from the people. And I think that is where the challenge is. It's not coming because many are lost about what to do. Should we, how much to protect themselves? Because there's a real fear of contracting the virus. So what do? Follow government rules, which might be excessive, or actually depend on institutions to call for that accountability without fear or favor. So it's a critical time, and I think we can offer advice, but we really hope that those people who can make the decisions will actually listen to some of the very important things that have been said today.
Thank you, Cynthia, and very well said. And Ivy, we'll leave it to you to give us a final word. What do you think is the most important measure that governments should be adopting in their COVID-19 response and recovery?
Thanks so much. I guess the first thing I wanted to mention, just to paint a picture of this time in history that we're all in, that governments are actually mobilizing the biggest stimulus and safety net packages we have seen since the Second World War. And that in itself kind of jolts you into the reality that we actually, now more than ever, we need that public input and oversight and protected civic space, especially now, right? And just echoing what my panelists have already said, like, because of these massive stimulus packages, it's critical and it's important that we ensure that transparency, participation, public oversight are integral and mandated as part of the response, recovery, and resilience measures. I know this is particularly hard, taking Cynthia's point as well. And just one thing that reminds me of the work that OGP does is we know that government is not monolithic. In the example that Hector mentioned on COVID budget tracker, these groups of citizens actually tried to find government people who can disclose data, who can do it little by little, until we get that reusable data that's easy to understand by citizens. So I think making sure that we find these champions, creating those spaces, even claiming those spaces and broadening it as much as we can, this is possible. And just going on to my last point, that we need to be creating space for multi-stakeholder participation and deliberation. It's hard, but it's way more important and essential for us to actually shape longer-term efforts and build a world that we can live in after COVID.
Thank you so much, panelists, for this rich discussion, for your insights. We know that these issues around rule of law, around transparency, accountability, oversight, open civic space, anti-corruption, were critical issues before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic, like it has with so many issues, it's helped highlight the importance of the issues, exacerbated them, allowed governments in many cases to use the pandemic response maybe as an excuse to make the problems even worse. So these are challenges amidst the pandemic, but they will not end once the pandemic is over. It's an ongoing battle. So I just thank you for your insights here. I also want to, in closing, to make sure that the audience knows that the World Justice Project has recently begun releasing a series of policy briefs on the twin crisis of public health and the rule of law. We encourage you to visit WJP's website, and you're getting links now on the chat about it. Also stay tuned for news in the next couple of months this fall on the next edition of World Justice Project's World Justice Challenge, which will invite the global rule of law community to showcase their most innovative projects addressing the intersection of the COVID-19 crisis and the rule of law. Also, our other organizer here, OGP, has launched the Open Response and Open Recovery campaign to highlight the ways in which transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and public participation can make a difference. So visit their website. You've received some of the links in the chat, including and importantly the OGP Guide to Open Government and the Coronavirus, which is a one-stop shop for current resources to how open government projects and approaches can support tackling the pandemic across several policy areas. So I thank you again, panelists. For those of you who aren't familiar with the organizations that the panelists represent, please become familiar with them. I thank you. I'm grateful for all of the work and the commitment and the passion that each of you and your organizations bring to this really important issue. And thank you to the audience for your participation. And we will be, the organizers will be sending around a recording. It'll be circulated after the event. So I encourage you all to share that widely on social media channels. And with that, I say goodbye. It's 1/2 past the hour and we've run out of time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Take care.